what we should strive for is for understanding rather than toleration. Toleration is simply, or you do you, I'll do myself, but it doesn't lead to conversation, to curiosity about the other, to being neighbors.
Hey everyone, it's Disagreeing Well, the podcast about polarization, why it matters, what drives it, and what we should be doing about it. I'm your host, John Malloy, and one of the themes that's emerged in this podcast series is that at the heart of polarization is often a growing unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with people who hold perspectives different from your own, especially when those perspectives are ones that we don't fully understand. We often think of polarization in political terms, but it shows up in other areas, including the topic of this week's podcast, religion. I mean, when you think about it, on the one hand, religious belief or non-belief shapes how people see the world and who they understand themselves to be. On the other hand, religion often feels deeply personal and private, and in a secular society, many question whether it has any role in the public sphere. That's where the work of the Center for Civic Religious Literacy becomes especially important. CCRL is a national non-religious organization dedicated to helping Canadians better understand religious, spiritual, and non-religious worldviews, not so that we agree with one another, but so that we can live and work together more honestly and effectively, breaking down barriers and building bridges. Today, I'm joined by three people involved in that work. Alice Chan is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Civic Religious Literacy. Hicham Tiflati is a subject matter expert with CCRL and a humanities professor who specializes in religion, secularism, Muslim identities, and social cohesion, particularly within Francophone Quebec. And Margie Patrick is also a subject matter expert with CCRL and a professor of education whose research and teaching focus on how religion and worldviews are addressed in school curricula and teacher education. Alice, Hish, and Margie, welcome to Disagreeing Well.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
It's great to have you here today. Three, it's the largest group that we've ever had so far on the podcast. And I want to hear about the work that you're doing right now, but I also want to hear about the journey that brought you to the positions that you hold, your whole interest in really creating bridges around the issue of faith. Why don't we start, Alice? You're the head of CCRL. Why don't we start with you and tell us a bit about your journey and how you came to this role?
Thanks so much, John, for having us here. And my journey is very windy, I would say. There's a lot of details in there, but really the two main things that brought me into this work about religion, which I never thought I would be part of, is one, when I was teaching middle school students in the Toronto area, Greater Toronto area, my dad passed away. So in 2011, he was 59 years old, and it was my greatest fear, like the greatest fear, that my parents would pass away at an early age, because I knew that they were older than a lot of parents around me. And then he passed away, and I was devastated. But it was, as a Christian, my faith really helped me. In the Bible, we read about and learn about the peace that surpasses all understanding. And that is firmly, I can say, surprisingly and gratefully, what I experienced during that time. However, when I was teaching, the students would ask me when I went back to class, "Miss, how are you?" They were so genuine and sincere. I wanted to respond and say, I'm actually well because da 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 because of my faith. But I had never ever in my whole life in the Toronto area seen anybody talk about their faith and in such a personal way in a public school environment. I had never, no frame of reference. And so personally, I felt like I was stuck. I felt so insincere and disingenuous to these students who cared. And then at the same time, I was teaching the same school, the same class, and I saw bullying in the classroom related to religion. And then I was stumped again from a professional standpoint, not a personal one, where I wanted to address the issue, but my students, I knew I had to because it's a bullying incident, but then I didn't have any teaching experience or support or skills to say, okay, this is religion related. How do I talk about this? How do I address this? I had zero point of reference. And so, way too many questions led me to my PhD on religious bullying. What is this? Religious literacy. What is that I'm learning about? And how can one inform the other in a public school setting? So, having grew up in the Toronto area where diversity was all around me, I never, people took world religions class and they thought, that's important. I thought, why is it important? Why would I do that? I have all this diversity around me. I can just learn from my friends, but I didn't. And I didn't learn it in teacher training. And all these, I didn't experiences led me to realize how important this conversation is, and later co-finding CCRL. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I wanted to pause there in case, you want to move forward, or it's time to hear from the others.
No, that's great. That's a great introduction, and I want to come back a bit to this whole question of faith and some of the divisions, but I want to hear everyone else's story. So, Hish, how did you become involved?
Well, I've have been teaching for more than two decades. I started teaching in Morocco at elementary school, and once I finished, I had a bachelor in Sharia, literally from Sharia University in Morocco. Then I moved to Boston for a master's in special education. Finished that. Served a few years as a special educator, and I also worked in two Islamic schools in Massachusetts. And that's when I realized that there are certain challenges to practical Islamic theology when it comes to teaching of issues on evolution, issues on gay marriage, on intersectionality, on homosexuality, etc., etc. And that's when I decided to dig deeper into religion and Islamic studies, and I moved north here to Quebec to start a PhD in religious studies, in Islamic studies. So a bachelor's in Islam, a master's in education, and a PhD in Islamic education. So I combined my experience for the last 20 years. But I also realized that the challenge that faith of Islam in this case, the challenge that we see in Islam in Western societies, that it needed more study, more research, more practical solutions, especially, as I said, when it comes to education. We have faculties of theology, for instance, of teaching. If just, for instance, if you want to become a theology teacher, we have a department for you. We teach you through Catholicism how to become a theology professor or a theology teacher from within the faith. And we did not have, and we still don't. There is one example in Toronto, but it's very shy. And I met Alice at McGill, and I was invited later to join CCRL.
That's great. That's as I say, lots to unpack there. But Margie, let's get you to jump in with your story.
So, also from the world of K to 12 education, I taught high school social studies in British Columbia. Having a political science and history undergrad, I was always fascinated with talking about controversial issues and current events. And so I did that a lot in the community where I was teaching. There were a lot of Christians and a lot of Sikhs. And so it was also, I was teaching in a Christian school, trying to bridge that. There was a bit of a divide in my community between those two different religious groups. And what I started to learn there is the idea of story, that everybody has a story, and that one way of building bridges is to understand each other's stories. Then I'm coming to a teacher prep program here in Edmonton, and with a hardening of positions that we have seen over time, particularly after the pandemic, trying to think about how do I teach my students who are going to be teachers in this time of polarization. How do they talk about controversial issues and current events? We've always known that there's a fear there. Everybody's afraid of misspeaking, of being called on the carpet for something that they said. And so the safest route is not to talk about them. And I beg my students to talk about it, because if you don't do it as a teacher, where are students going to go? They're going to go on the internet, and we have to teach them good critical thinking skills, historical thinking skills, And really, that has really led me to thinking a whole lot deeper about polarization. Now, my second year curriculum and instruction course for social studies, it is all dedicated to how do we teach controversial issues in an age of polarization. And I center the whole thing around listening to each other's stories. If we're going to help each other get past polarization, we have to recognize we are all story people. And if we can hear each other's stories, we might be able to get past. So we look at all different kind of ways of doing that. And then I think the civic aspect, right? Because the civic aspect of social studies is how do we live together well with our differences, not to get rid of our differences, but to recognize those differences. And so those are really the two driving ideas that when I first heard about CCRL, I met Alice at a conference and it just struck me as making sense. And it dovetailed really well with what I'd already been thinking.
And I think what's fascinating about the introductions that you've all given is how it fits into this discussion of polarization. Because the one thing that we've spent so much time exploring in this podcast series is yes, it's true, polarization can be used to describe a situation where, someone's on an extreme position, has taken an extreme position on something. Someone else has taken the other extreme position. They're very much in favor of the death penalty. The other one's absolutely opposed. But polarization can also mean, and to use Margie's term, not wanting to hear the other person's story, dismissing the other person's story, only wanting to engage with the other person in order to get enough information to sort of beat them over the head rhetorically by telling them they're wrong. And we often think of that in terms of politics, but what I'm hearing from all three of you is that it also moves into religion, that being in a call it a secular setting, many of you have mentioned a classroom, and you have people with different religious backgrounds, where we don't want to know about it. We're going to make all sorts of assumptions about it. We may, in fact, bully that person, try to silence that person. So, do you just want to talk about how the work you do, or this issue of religion, sort of fits into this growing polarization that we're seeing in Canada? Who wants to take that one? Alice, you're smiling.
Yes, thanks, John. Religion definitely applies to this conversation on polarization because religion is one of those topics in Canada that has always been taboo. Things that you don't talk about, that you don't want to engage in. And that makes it easier to dig your heels in and not want to engage because there's no frame of reference to know how to do that. And so for us, we're doing the complete opposite. We want to address polarization, break it down when it comes to religion, spirituality, and secular perspectives, because right now there is hardly any engagement between these groups. Maybe some specific ones, multi faith, interfaith groups, and communities in different parts of Canada are intentionally doing it, but the majority of Canadians, this is, polarization fits perfectly into this because they don't even know how to start engaging.
And Hish, you're coming at this, as a subject matter specialist, looking at the Muslim tradition, and I mean the Muslim tradition is a a minority tradition in Canada. So I mean it must be even more of a challenge for Muslim students, where they are perhaps just a handful in a classroom setting or another setting.
Yeah, well, obviously, we just start by saying that religious illiteracy will eventually lead to polarization. But it depends on how we define polarization. But social polarization is about having divisive, multiple camps opposing to one another with no way of understanding or agreement. We don't have to agree, but at least if we can understand one another. Religious illiteracy, when it comes to Islam and Muslim identities and Islamic issues, will and is eventually leading to lots of ignorance and lots of polarization. We stereotype what we don't understand. And religion is not a private matter. So that's one of it's private, just keep it at home, keep it in your closet. It's religions are not the same, and certain religions or the adherents, the believers of certain religions have to, not all of them, but many, those who are devout, have to be visible in public. So the claim is to just remove, be invisible, and remove your religious manifestation in public so that we can agree and talk. It just doesn't stand with religious illiteracy.
And I think that's such an important point because I imagine the reaction of a lot of individuals is, look, politics is going to find its way, and politics loosely defined is going to find its way into many discussions. But at the end of the day, what someone does for an hour in their place of worship or what they do behind closed doors, that's private, that's personal. People may even be hesitant to raise it with someone, and yet religion can't be privatized, it can't be compartmentalized. And Margie, I know you and I have had that discussion in other venues, so do you want to pick up on that as what do you say to people who say, look, religion is just a private matter, we shouldn't even be having this discussion?
Yeah, so I really have 2 points, and one of them is I think what CCRL does and what we should strive for is for understanding rather than toleration. Toleration is simply, or you do you, I do, I'll do myself, but it doesn't lead to conversation, to curiosity about the other, to being neighbors. And so, what we talk about, and I think it was Hish that used the word understanding, we have to understand each other. Why is it that, let's just take hijab? Why do you wear hijab? And it's not just, well, you just go do you. It's let's have an understanding, let's have a conversation. Because if we don't understand, we don't then understand why sometimes religious rights, religious practices need to be protected, right? And I think then the other part is that public spaces need to be plural spaces rather than secular spaces. And I would argue that about public schools as well. Secularism is not nothing, it has particular understandings and commitments and belief structures. People still ascribe to something. And so then it is people of faith, certain spiritualities, that then are they're told that they have to leave their beliefs at the door when they enter public space, and other people don't because it's secular space. So people who have secular understandings, they don't have to park beliefs at the door. So I think if we reconceptualize public space as plural spaces, and there's nothing easy about it, I will grant that, but we will have to have conversations, and those are hard conversations about what that might look like. There are still going to be, for lack of a better word at the moment, rules in place about how we engage each other. That common space then is not just open for everything. There still is hate speech. There still will be ways in which we engage each other that is acceptable and unacceptable. But it just means that we recognize that not everybody is able to leave who they are and their religious identity at the door when they go and engage in common conversations.
And I mean, I think it's important just to spend a few more minutes on this question of identity. Faith instills a worldview. So when you're coming to public policy issues, when you're coming to just how we're going to live a common life together, that faith is going to help inform what moves forward. I mean, if an individual grew up in poverty, if an individual didn't grow up in wealth, if an individual's from another country, all those things inform it, and we seem to be quite prepared to accept that. But it's interesting when it comes to faith, people get very uncomfortable because, again, not about somehow imposing your faith on others, but a person with a faith background is going to see the world in a certain way. A person who's an atheist or agnostic is going to see the world in a certain way, and there needs to be that recognition that they could bring it all to the table. But I don't think that's always there. I don't know. I'm sure that's. I mean, I'm now getting to the core of what CCRL is all about. Does someone want to pick up on that? Hish, you're looking like you're ready to comment on this whole question of identity, and that you can't separate it.
Yeah, it's I would say it's almost impossible to separate the religion from society, and even the religion from politics. The claim that religion can be privatized is just, it's nonsense for, according to many scholars, from Talal Assad, who claims that, who says that the private nature of religion is a political modern invention. It's this, once we had the nation state needed to regulate cultures and religions and traditions in the nation, and we needed to secularize. We have Jose Casanova, who insists that what we are seeing in the last 2 3 decades is that religion is being deprivatized. It's moving back into the public space. Even our Charles Taylor, when he talks about this, our social imaginary, is every nation's social imaginary is rooted, is deeply ingrained or rooted in religious concepts of the higher good. The talks about the nation, the supremacy of the nation, are talks about the higher good. Voting is a public act of faith. Marriage, eating habits, our financial decisions, our public calendar is not neutral. It's based on sacred days of the majority. So claims that we can just separate and have a secular, neutral society don't make sense for many.
But what about, turning it all around here? What about the argument, though, that, at the end of the day, I'll quote you, Margie, you be you, you believe something because of your religious tradition. You have no right to try to impose it on me. You have no right to bring it to the public square because it's based on, some might say superstition or some holy book that I don't believe in. What do you say back to that? And Alice, I think you were signaling you wanted to jump in on the discussion.
Yeah. To ground this conversation, I wanted to add a few definitions for us to consider. So, most people, we use the word diversity, right? Diversity is the existence of differences. But then Margie added the word pluralism. And the way that we understand pluralism at CCRL is quite grounded and related to Diana Eck's uh, definition of pluralism at Harvard Divinity, where she describes pluralism as the engagement with diversity. And she has four very clear criteria to talk about what that engagement looks like. So diversity is a fact, but pluralism is the engagement with diversity. And then there is covenantal pluralism that Seipel and Hoover, also in the US, have conceptualized to understand that it's the agreement that a willingness to be in a pluralistic society, act plurally while having our disagreements and holding that space and listening to each other. So we commit to pluralism even if we think differently. And that is really important because that speaks to those who say you do you. And in a way, yes, that is, some people, that's where you will be. But there still needs to be engagement because we live in a society. At the end of the day, we live in a society. We need to recognize each other's humanity and create, at the end of the day, everybody wants a sense of belonging and welcoming space. And one group, I think, there's many different examples we can offer, but what I think these days that stalls this conversation is a lack of examples of how people have been able to do this despite their differences. And one that we've really learned about through one of our partners, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation in the US, they work with multinational organizations. They have a READY index every year, the Religious Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index, where they rank lots of different multinational businesses from around the world, understand how they are incorporating religious diversity in their workspace. And through that engagement and their work, we've learned that Google has an interbelief network. So lots of organizations have ERGs, employee resource groups. Different ones might choose to. We've seen, I think it's American Express says, this is the Sikh group, this is a Hindu employee resource group, this is a Muslim one, etc., etc. Whereas Google has decided to have an interbelief network where people who are humanists, agnostics, atheists are side by side with those who are devout Jews, Christians, etc., etc. And this, is an example, again, not a lot of people know about, but this is pluralism in action. This is covenantal pluralism, where people in one ERG is working together and volunteer together, doing things and representative of Google, but American Express, all of those different ERGs, distinct groups for those religious groups and non-religious groups also volunteered together to say, hey, let's go to take care of this food bank, which I think a number of them did during COVID. So, the tension we have is, I think, the uh, yeah, again, a lack of example, a lack of willingness, because we don't know how to do it. We've never seen other people do it, or we don't think it's possible. And we think, they're so different from us. So how could we ever dot, 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 dot. But really, once we start talking and getting to know each other, there's a lot more similarities, while we also recognize the differences, and people have done that, and we can still do that while having a relationship with each other.
That's a great segue into the specific work of your organization. I mean, what your programming, what your mandate is, that sort of thing. So, Alice, why don't I keep you for that question and then open it up to Margie and Hicham their roles. So what is CCRL? What does it do?
Yeah, we do a lot of different things, all focused on education. So, our charitable mandate is to offer religious literacy from an educational perspective for educational purposes. But what does that look like? It really depends on who we work with. So, our work is almost all project based, so that the religious literacy education we offer is based on research that we conduct with partners, based on a regional lens, because we know our work in Canada in northern Alberta will look different from rural New Brunswick, for example. And we work with partners from each of these regions and maybe the sectors, so that we have a more comprehensive, full solution towards addressing some form of question that they might have related to religion, spirituality, or secular perspectives, or an issue that they are seeing. So that's kind of the nutshell, what we do, how we do it. But each program looks quite different. We start them differently. One in particular in Northern Ontario that we started with the Rural Development Network based in Alberta, also partnered with the City of Timiskaming Shores, Keepers of Circle, the Indigenous hub that's there, their local Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation that I just mentioned. We all partnered together based on an observation that the economic development officer in the city had. He said, people are leaving our town, but we need more workers. We need more hands. We need economic development, but I see that it's tied to social well-being. People are leaving because they don't have a sense of religious community here. They're going to Southern Ontario. What can we do? And so together, all of us sat and brainstorm, how can we, one, address and support your economic development while supporting social well-being, seeing that there was discrimination experienced in the area, discomfort, tensions between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous community, as well as newcomers coming in. Lots of people, but also employers not willing to hire people whose last name they didn't recognize, for example. So, what could we do? And so, as a result, after a 2 year project that followed with another 2 year, 3 year project, we offered a faith and belief friendly certification for employers so that they could say, we have religious literacy, we understand the different perspectives in our community, and for anybody else who will come, and even clients who might drop by this town in their travels, let us show you that we are friendly environment. As well, we created the employee resource group, but specific to the rural town, where it wasn't to one single employer, because that wouldn't make sense for a small medium-sized employer, but rather the employee resource group was equivalent to a lunch and learn for the whole community, and everybody was able to join from regardless of what business to that lunch and learn to hear from locals who were guest speakers from different religious or non-religious backgrounds, but also get to know each other, build community. Because what we learned there, it's just how important community is in a small town. The social is completely tied to the economic in a very lived daily way. You can't really separate the two. Community life is part of work as much as it is in outside of work hours. And so in that project, we were able to work with a number of employers to support them in religious literacy knowledge, help them engage more and understand their local indigenous community more, and really start building the relationships and help them feel confident in bridging this conversation, which a number of people were curious about, but never did it together in community and didn't know how to proceed.
And I think the key from what I'm hearing is, and it goes back to your earlier example of how different companies have organized this. This isn't a session, unless I'm wrong, about how do I understand Islam? How do I understand Judaism? How do I understand? But just how do I understand religion? And the fact is that I'm going to have employees, I'm going to have colleagues, I'm going to have members of the community who are with different religious faiths. And what does that mean? That's a very, very different approach than kind of this, I think you mentioned at the beginning, this sort of interfaith where all Muslims go to that side of the room, all, Christians to the other, or all, Presbyterians to the other, and we'll try to figure out how to work together. So a very interesting approach moving through. Margie, do you want to talk about some of the work that you've done then to support this and what some of the outcomes have been?
Sure. So Alice and I have been working on a project in BC. We are starting our third year with this project. And this was three agencies from the lower mainland of British Columbia who reached out to CCRL. They had read an article that some of us had written, and three organizations that work with people with disabilities. And they said, we do a really good job taking care of the social needs of the people that we serve, the physical needs, all kinds of needs, but we don't do anything with their spiritual needs. And so we'd like to explore what that might look like and how we could even start to think through what that might look like. And so it has really developed over time. We started then with what do the agency staff, how do they see their role in that? Do they even see themselves as having a role for that? And what we discovered there is that everybody, or it's a vast majority of people, do see the people that they serve as being spiritual beings and having spiritual needs, but they really don't know how to do that. They really want some education in that. They want some guidelines, because in the absence of all that, again, there's a whole lot of fear. Are we going to overstep? Are we going to overreach? What can we say? What can't we say? And again, as one CEO said to us, and what's really very exciting about this project is we had support for the project right up through the CEOs. And they were very supportive. And as one CEO said, yeah, we're asking staff to park their beliefs at the door. And he just mused about how fair is that? What can we expect of people when we ask them to do that? So it was just amusing. It was an important musing to do that. So staff really did want guidelines. They wanted education. So that was one part of the project. Then the organizations hired someone who did self-identify as having a disability to offer what they call some experiences to offer people in the community. There were both people with disabilities and people without disabilities to come together and to have conversations about it. And they had some experiences. They went to a nature park, and they really focused those experiences around four connections. They identified spirituality as connection to self, other, nature, and the transcendence. And they had four kind of conversations, experiences for each one. So this huge, beautiful nature park in Vancouver they went to, they took nature walks, they made flower arrangements to give to each other. They did various things. They looked at what are some ways that people do kind of, have meditative or transcendent experiences. So they did a lot of that. They went to sacred houses of worship and sacred spaces. And so we talked to 6 people that had gone through some of those processes and those experiences. And it was amazing, because people with intellectual disabilities said, of course we're spiritual beings, and we've been engaged in this for as long as we can remember. This is not new to us. It is new to the broader community. And yes, this is the first time that we are talking about this, but that doesn't mean that we haven't been doing this all along. So that was really quite an insight. This project is interesting because so much of the research to date has been done in the United States has been really focused on how churches can be opening spaces, can be welcoming spaces. So this was a Canadian context, and hearing from people within the disability community themselves, because so often the literature is about them. So we really did highlight their voices. And I think some of what they told us was it was really from the heart. And they talked about how their spirituality slash religion really helped them to become resilient in the face of a lot of discrimination, because people defined them by their disability. And they were saying, no, we're not going to take that anymore. This is who I am. And so, with those connections to self, others, nature, and the transcendence, they talked a lot about the connection to self. And what we heard in that was reclaiming agency to really reclaim their own sense of identity and to stop letting everyone else identify who they were by their disability. And they talked about how either religion or spirituality had really helped them to reclaim that agency. So it was fascinating. After every interview we had, Alice and I would just stay on the line there and go, wow, that was such an amazing interview. And now we're in the stage of dealing with parents or family members. So we had surveys that went out, and the question is, do you want these agencies to provide this kind of support to your family member with a disability? And as with other stages, yes, they certainly do see their family member as being a spiritual being, but whether they want agencies to really be involved, it's about 50-50. So it's not an easy road for how the agencies might proceed with this. So that's ongoing conversations.
Well, that leads to another question. We've talked about how faith is part of your identity, that you can't leave it at the door, etc. But it also is very personal and it's very private. And I wonder how you deal with the line. Where do you not start probing your colleague, your student, etc. And Hish, you're have a expertise, obviously, with Islam, with the Muslim faith. There, you have, I'm thinking of women who are hijab or niqab. I mean, there it's very visual. And I guess how does CCRL deal with this? On the one hand, the person wants to be seen as the very competent person in accounting, not the Muslim in accounting, but at the same time, the goal is how do you build a community that's not going to ignore that aspect. So how do you walk that line? And Hish, as I say, with your particular expertise, you probably have to think about that question a lot.
Yeah, well, obviously, but first, but faith is not a hobby, and even if some of us or some out there believe that it's a hobby, it's not a quite hobby. That's pushing against the privatization of faith. The niqabis, so those who wear niqab, we call them niqabis, and those who wear hijab are hijabis. Uh, the niqab, for instance, is a very minor phenomenon in Quebec and even in France. And the way we deal with it is the way we deal with any other religious manifestation. It is a religious manifestation. It's cultural for some, because many scholars, Islamic scholars, would insist that niqab has nothing to do with the religion. That it's not mentioned in the Quran. It's not mentioned in the tradition, and most scholars don't see that it's an obligation for women to cover their faces. But in a Western secular or post-secular, we tend to forget that we live in a post-secular society. We're behind secularism. In a post secular society, usually we deal with rights and constitutions and charters of rights and freedoms. And the questions we tackle, usually, at least from my point of view or from my expertise, is that it's a religious manifestation. And even if we try to understand, the understanding religious manifestations are difficult. I did interview more than 50 hijabi women, and I can tell you, no two women have the same exact understanding about why they are wearing that hijab. Some of them, it's just about religion because it's a part of the faith. For others, it's cultural, and for others, and to my surprise, I had three here in Quebec from 2013 to 2016, where I was one of the main coordinators of a study on Muslim identities in Canada. I had three participants who mentioned that they wear the hijab because they are on welfare and cannot afford a nice haircut, and they don't have a nice hair. And that, to my surprise, coming from a Muslim society and growing up Muslim. So what we do at CCRL and in academia in general is that we try to enlighten and we try to educate and we try to show the complexity of the phenomenon of a religion. It's never black and white, and it's never a straightforward answer, and it's always evolving. What Islam was 100 or 150 or 150 years ago is not the same as Islam now, and that can be said about any faith or any religion.
But if I have a colleague, and let's have the scenario, it's not a close colleague, not someone who's a have I have some sort of friendship with, but it's a colleague who wears a hijab. Where are the boundaries? Am I supposed to engage that person about their faith? Am I supposed to ignore it? Am I supposed to, like, I guess I'm just wondering, because on the one hand, for many of us, it's an opportunity to learn, to better engage, to understand the person. But for the person who I used the example earlier, who's in accounting, who wants to talk about the books, is it an intrusion in their privacy if you try to raise it? And obviously, I'm raising the Muslim tradition. There are other traditions too where there is this sort of visual manifestation, which is going to lead to potentially questions or not questions, people avoiding it. So Hish, I don't know what's the. Oh, Alice, you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I hope you don't mind, Hish. This is where I think it's based on your role as a colleague. Are you the manager? And then also your relationship, right? If your colleagues at the same level, what is your relationship with this person? Do you talk to them on a regular basis? Are you just going up and saying, I see you wearing a hijab. Can you tell me about it? Like, that's very awkward. The thing about religion is, if people have a different place in their mind, right? Any topic about religion is like, oh, that kind of idea. Whereas if you see it as trying to understand an aspect of that person, like any other aspect, then is it, you know, it's likewise, if you never talk to this person, you're not going to go up to them and ask them, do you go swimming regularly, or something really random. It's all about relationship, and how do you perceive this conversation? Are you going in to get to know the person, or are you going in to make a statement, make a claim, and you know put some kind of judgment on them, make an argument? Because I think a lot of people, if the relationship is there, it's this is something you can be curious about and say, how you frame the question also matters. Your attitude about this also matters. It's like, I noticed that you do this. I've never talked to anybody about it. Do you mind helping me understand, why do you wear the hijab? Right? I hear lots of stories, but why do you do it? Like, that's also very different. Like, many years ago, I had a wonderful colleague. We talked about work all the time. Every so often, a sprinkle of personal stuff. And then one day, out of the blue, she said, Alice, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is Chan a Chinese last name? Are you Chinese? And in my mind, I'm like, that's such a simple question. And I don't know how long she had been holding that, right? And we had great relationship, but for me, it was a no-brainer, simple, easy to respond to. And maybe depending on, again, your relationship, how you ask the question, maybe the person, colleague who wears a hijab might be very happy to share it with you and see that, oh, you're interested in who I am, let me tell you. Right. Whereas if it's a manager, it's also could be very different. Why are you asking as a manager? And really, have you set the tone in your work, in your team and your workplace, to say we can have these conversations, and it's for the purpose of supporting you in the workplace, supporting you as an individual, so that you're comfortable in this workplace. Right. Like, all there's many layers.
But I also know that CCRL makes it very clear that when you go into those types of conversations or that interaction, that you shouldn't go in with a whole pile of assumptions. So, something you read somewhere, or to pick up on what Hish was saying, that you had a someone in your life who had a hijab and they wore it for this reason or that reason, that there's not a diversity within religious traditions itself. In fact, I know you have sort of 5 themes or 5 principles that you operate on. So maybe you want to share those. Alice, again, you're the leading force. You want to explain what those 5 are?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And Hish, Margie, please feel free to add. But really, we have 5 principles that kind of give us the structure, a framework of how we understand religious literacy. Because we outline these 5 principles because in the U.S. it might mean just about religion for some groups. When they think about religious literacy in Europe, actually, they approach it differently as well. But we are very mindful of our Canadian context. So our 5 principles keep all of this in mind. The first principle is that we recognize there is internal diversity in all worldviews. So, as you just mentioned, John, yes, why one person wears hijab may not be the same reason why another person wears hijab. And we need to recognize that, and how they even practice Islam, and or how they express their Muslim identity. All of this is very diverse based on their personal experience, or even where they might be living in Canada, or where they may have grown up from different parts of the world. All of that comes into play. So we need to, as you mentioned, like, keep an open mind. We don't go in with assumptions. Second principle is that there's external diversity. So often that's kind of a no-brainer. It's like, of course, Hinduism is not the same as Sikhism, is not the same as Jainism, is not the same as Islam, but then or even Buddhism. But when you look at it, there's actually quite a lot of similarities. But the important part of this principle is to see that, and acknowledge the differences, because people have affiliated, adhered to, chosen some of these particular religious beliefs because of the differences. And it's just as important to recognize that, and really recognize the people, and their choice, and how Sikhism came out of Hinduism, for example, the importance of that for a reason. And then the third one is to recognize that uh, worldviews do not exist in a vacuum. Secularism, Hish often reminds us, secularism is not separate from religion. One informs the other, especially if we're thinking of, like, Quebec is a classic example, Catholic Church, how the history and its embedded nature in Quebec's history and politics, business, education, healthcare, and even knocking at the door to ask people, how many children are you have you give birth to, and are you giving birth to more? Like, all of that has led to why secularism is so prominent in Quebec today. That kind of fluidity in this conversation is what this third principle helps us remember, that religion and worldviews, secular, spiritual, religious, never exist in a vacuum. It informs society in the past and present, and society informs it as well. The fourth principle is to recognize that this conversation, even though our work is religious literacy informed, because of Canadian history and our current demographics, it absolutely needs to include spiritual and secular worldviews, especially Indigenous spiritualities. We're very mindful of our process in learning more about Indigenous culture, history on our team, and in the different parts of Canada. And we want to make sure we continue that and share that awareness with others too. And then the fifth principle is to understand that, yeah, everybody is different, and we need to recognize that terminology, practices, all of this is unique to the individual. So it kind of links to the first principle, but this one requires us to see that even if we use the word prayer, we need to understand, are we using how we understand prayer to understand and conceive and interpret the person in front of us and how they are understanding prayer? Are we using our own lens to interpret others? Or are we stepping back and being able to say, okay, this is how I see it, but prayer might mean something different to the person in front of me. How do they understand it? And maybe what terms do they use? What practices do they have? And how is this informed by, all the experiences or culture or influences in their lives? So the last principle is actually quite challenging in many ways because it requires more listening, more humility, and reflection from the individual.
It's interesting that the underlying our whole discussion today has been about the complexity of faith, its interaction with the wider world, the place that the secular views have. The list goes on. And CCRL, although a national organization, is headquartered in Quebec. For many, particularly outside of Quebec, we've been watching what's been going on with obviously Bill 21, the Supreme Court right now, other measures that have been brought in. Bill 9 recently passed, curbing things like prayer in public, that sort of thing. So I just wonder, this whole tension between what's going on in Quebec and CCRL's mandate and the broader mandate. I know, Hish, you've been very involved with discussions in Quebec about this. So maybe you want to tell us what's going on the ground, things that perhaps people outside of Quebec don't recognize in terms of this debate about secularism in Quebec.
Oh, yeah, sure. But let me just add one sentence, or just tackle your question quickly about how to deal with others. I'm guilty as well, and I'm coming from a Muslim background. I have Muslim students. How do I know that they're Muslim? Because we face, or we suffer as a society, from what we call in sociology either the racialization, the ethnicization, or the nationalization of religion. If your name is Muhammad and you come from Tunisia, you're Muslim. We don't care. And during my first year at the college, I had a student named Muhammad, and it was Ramadan. And I said, Happy Ramadan, buddy. And he told me, Sir, I'm not Muslim. So if my colleague is a hijabi, she probably embraces another worldview that I don't understand, or probably not the worldview that I imagine. The reason I keep mentioning this example, because which we call the racialization of Muslimness or of religion, because I have another colleague, I'm not going to say his last name, his name is Muhammad, and he is a militant atheist based in Quebec. So the Bill 21, Bill 84, and Bill 9 recently, we realize that there is a challenge, that we tend to forget that Quebec was one of the last Western nations to secularize its institutions. The Quiet Revolution was in the 50s and the 60s. That's very recent compared to France, for instance, that had its first laïcité law in 1905. And they had debates and revolutions around the religion and the kingdom and the king and how to manage society. But the challenge that we have in Quebec with Bill 21 and other bills is that it looks like, at least from my participants and from the few scholars that work on the field, it looks like institutionalized bias, because it's about laïcité, it's about the state being neutral, but only one worldview is seen as the default. So even the state's claim of neutrality, it might become just a facade that protects the majority's lifestyle when it comes to religion. Because we look at Catholicism as culture, as Charles Taylor said. There are issues with jobs, for instance. Now, the last 2-3 weeks after passing Bill 9, a few hijabi, dozens. I mean, the number I saw 70 something, and there are hundreds to come. Hijabi teachers who work in their care, either as teachers or even as staff, because Bill 9 expanded to all staff at schools, even on school ground. Even volunteers now cannot wear religious symbols. So there is that, as I said, the culture loophole that once we rebrand the majority's religious tradition as national culture, because it's in the public, it's public. For instance, that Bill 29 will ban state employees from taking a religious holiday, even one, while others, we know that the calendar is based on a religious tradition. But we also say that we do not discriminate on the basis of race and religion and nationality and gender. But religion is one of them. So that's the challenge. We will wait what the Supreme Court says. But I believe that, because it's not just Quebec, the notwithstanding clause, Quebec, Alberta, and other provinces. What happens at the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court decides, will impact Canada for at least another 50 years.
So it's something that all of us are watching, obviously within Quebec and CCRL and as an organization, and people like you, Hish, are obviously trying to get a continue the dialogue about this and the complexity of religion. But it's, as you say, something to watch in terms of its impact. But I guess the broader question is, are you optimistic, the three of you, or are you pessimistic? Margie, maybe you should get the last word, because you're dealing with teachers, you're dealing with education, you're dealing with sort of the next generation and where it's headed. I mean, have you seen some signs of hope, I guess, to put you on the spot, or are you personally hopeful about where we're going in this discussion of creating this society? Whereas Alice said it's about pluralism, it's actually putting an effort into building these bridges and finding a way to make a common life together.
So I teach a course. I created a course for our students that's called Teaching in Religiously Diverse Classrooms. And it's really meant for those that are going into public schools to recognize you're going to have all kinds of religious and secular worldviews in your classroom. So how do you teach? And again, in a polarized era, what does that mean for you as a teacher? And students are interested. They recognize the importance of it, but I wish I could say that I was really positive, but there's two things that make me go, one of them is in 2021, the provincial government released a new version of the social studies curriculum. It was part of a whole revisioning of the curriculum from K to 12, and they have just now finished K to 6.
And this is in Alberta.
This is in Alberta, sorry. And in 2021, for that version, they did include, for the first time that I've been here, I've been in this province for 18 years, that they did include some education about religion in the social studies curriculum. Because, again, how do you understand the history of Canada without some understanding of the role that Christianity played? And if you're going to talk about immigration, let's talk about religious diversity that comes along with that. So I thought the inclusion of religion was a good thing, but how it was done was not. I wish they would have talked to some scholars of religious studies before they put it in terms of how do you do that in grade 2 and how do you do that in grade 5. The feedback, the online, the social media response was very, very strong. And it was really kind of bipolar. There were people that said, yes, of course, we need some education about religion. That's what it means to be an educated citizen. We need to have some knowledge about this. And then there was the other half that was saying, if you want any knowledge about religion, send your kids to Catholic school. But there's no room for that in a public school. And some of it was really demeaning. Something like, yes, maybe we should teach this so that our kids know what to run away from. And it's only okay if you teach it in the context of superstitions, right? So there was quite strong reaction to it, and it was also not rolled out with any kind of education about why we need this. There was no statement in the formatter about why is this important. So it was pulled, that whole curriculum. It was released in March of 2021. It was pulled because of public backlash by the end of 2021. And when it was re-released in 2024, all the religion was taken out. So I think what's happened is the way that it was done and included has set the conversation back, at least in Alberta, by at least a decade about should we even have any public education about religion. And now the government, just this past March 29th, has released a new tabled a bill that says that they want to relook again at to clarify the code of professional conduct for teacher and teacher leaders, that teachers and teacher leaders remain objective, present balanced perspective, and support students in expressing different viewpoints in the classroom. And again, like, what does that mean? Does that mean about white nationalists and we just let every student say whatever they want about that? About racism? Because I think what this is targeting is whatever is considered woke expression, but is this supposed to be a free for all? What does this mean for religious diversity? When I did some interviews with teachers, social studies teachers in secondary schools, I still remember one student saying to me, so who's not talking in my classroom? Conservative Muslim students aren't, because they know that there's no space for them and their views in the classroom. Okay, so what does this mean for what kind of classrooms we're having, who's allowed to speak and who's not? And I really do want classrooms to be spaces where, if we're going to teach civic skills and how to listen to each other and what does it mean to talk in public spaces, I always teach my students that when they're going to be teachers in a classroom, that they have to talk about, what is this space? This is a public space, which means you don't talk like you do with your friends in your basement while you're watching movies. You have to talk differently. This is a public space. And so, what are the rules around a public space and how do we engage in this public space? But that also doesn't mean that only some views are allowed. If you have honest questions, let's talk about them. Let's ask them. This is supposed to be a safe place where we learn about what does it mean to engage with people who are very different from us. How do we engage with really tough topics? What does it mean when I really disagree with you? And how are we still going to be neighbors and still talk with each other in ways that I still respect you as a human being, even though I really, really disagree with you? And I'm afraid that all of this kind of legislation, teachers are going to be afraid to talk about anything. And so the safe thing always is to just not talk about it. And religion is seen as being divisive. And so let's just not even talk about it.
I was just going to say two troubling reports, one from Quebec and one from Alberta. But I guess we have to remain optimistic that this work will keep going. And I guess the only bright, I don't know if it's really a silver lining to say the work of CCRL becomes even more important in the context that I put forward. So listen, we've only scratched the surface. Margie, some of the comments you made at the end could generate, I think, 3 or 4 podcasts on their own about difficult conversations in the classroom. But I think we've shed some light into I think a really, really important facet about this bridge building around the issue of religion. And I really want to thank all three of you for the work you're doing with CCRL, but also for joining us here on Disagreeing Well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you
Thank
for
so
having
much,
us, John.
Disagreeing Well will be taking a short break over the summer, but unless our divisions magically disappear, we'll be back again in the fall with more fascinating discussions about polarization, its causes, and what we can do about it. You've been listening to Disagreeing Well, a production of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, federated with Wilfrid Laurier University, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Disagreeing Well is produced and edited by Lauren Kivenhoven with additional production and promotional support from Hardika Ahuja. Our theme music is Stuck in Dreams by Kulikova, courtesy of Pixabay. You can find Disagreeing Well on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and please follow us there. To find links to each episode, show notes, and to learn more about the work of the Center for Public Ethics, you can also follow us on our free Substack. Thanks for listening.